2 years ago, I purchased my first house, a quaint 2-story building nestled in a quiet neighborhood. At 32, I felt it was time to settle into a place I could call my own. The excitement of unpacking and setting up my new home was overwhelming. I was single, living alone, but thrilled about the new chapter in my life. To help with the move, I invited a couple of friends, Jake and Matt, over to help unload the truck. They refused any money, so I paid them in pizza and beer. We spent the rest of the evening hanging out, laughing and talking about the future. At one point, Jake went to use the bathroom and came back, mentioning he heard odd noises coming from inside the walls. He joked about it being rats or maybe even ghosts, but I brushed it off, making a mental note to check the plumbing later. As the night progressed, my friends left, and I found myself alone in my new home. I stayed up late, binge-watching a new series on Netflix, enjoying the peace and quiet. However, around midnight, I started hearing faint thumping sounds from above. My bedroom was on the second floor, so the only thing above me was the attic. Jake's earlier comment about noises came rushing back to me. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled down the attic ladder, taking a deep breath before climbing up. The attic was dark and dusty, lit only by a single dim bulb. The noises had stopped, and the space was eerily silent. With no boxes up there yet, it was just an empty expanse, save for a couple of large framed paintings leaning against a wall. Relieved to find nothing unusual, I descended back to my room. But as soon as I settled into bed, the noises resumed, louder this time. It sounded like something was scratching and knocking on the walls. My mind raced with possibilities: raccoons, squirrels, maybe even bats. Determined to find the source, I grabbed a flashlight and went back to the attic. This time, I focused on the section above my bedroom. I noticed a wall that didn't extend the entire length of the house, partitioning off a small area. The scratching sound seemed to be coming from behind it. As I moved closer, my flashlight beam caught the edge of one of the paintings. They were slightly angled away from the wall, and my heart pounded as I realized what it might mean. With trembling hands, I lifted one of the paintings, revealing a dark, gaping hole behind it. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. There was a hidden space behind the wall. Before I could react, the painting was forcefully shoved out of my grip, crashing to the floor. A figure emerged from the darkness, a disheveled, sickly-looking woman. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her hair matted and dirty. She started laughing, a high-pitched, eerie sound that sent chills down my spine. She lunged at me, her nails digging into my shoulders, and I screamed, pushing her away with all my strength. I stumbled back, heart racing, and bolted for the attic ladder, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked myself in my bedroom and frantically dialed 911, my hands shaking as I told the operator about the crazed woman in my attic. Within minutes, the police arrived. 3 squad cars pulled up, and 5 officers entered my house. I heard a commotion from the attic, the woman's screams echoing through the house. The struggle continued for what felt like an eternity before it ended with the sound of a taser. The officers managed to subdue her, and I watched as they escorted her out of the house in handcuffs. She looked to be in her late 20s to early 30s, her face gaunt and pale. Once the situation was under control, I ventured back into the attic with the officers to inspect the secret room. It was a small, cramped space, filled with a pile of dirty blankets, a pillow, and heaps of food wrappers. The stench of human waste was overpowering, making it clear that she had been living there for quite some time. It was horrifying to think that this woman had been hiding in my house, possibly even before I moved in. The officers explained that she was taken to a nearby psychiatric center for evaluation and treatment. They assured me that she would receive the help she desperately needed. That first night in my new home turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. The thought of someone living in my walls, watching me, was beyond disturbing. It took weeks before I could sleep soundly again. I had security systems installed, motion sensor lights, and even considered moving. But eventually, I made peace with the house. Now, whenever I hear strange noises, I can't help but think back to that night. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not the ghosts or supernatural, but the real living people who hide in the shadows. My first housewarming was not what I expected, but it taught me a valuable lesson. Always be aware of your surroundings, because you never know who or what might be lurking just out of sight. Anna and I had been together for a decade and married for 2 years. Just a month ago, we moved into our dream home, a charming house on a quiet street in a small inland town in North Carolina called Cedarwood. We were excited to start this new chapter in our lives, imagining raising children and adopting a dog to play in our spacious backyard that backed up to a dense patch of woods. Both of us had similar work schedules. I typically returned home around 5, and Anna came in about an hour later. The first couple of nights went smoothly. It was the weekend, and we spent most of our time unpacking and settling in. It wasn't until Monday night that things took a bizarre turn. We had just turned off the lights, and were settling into bed when we heard it. A faint crackling melody drifting in from outside. Anna and I exchanged puzzled glances. Our nearest neighbors were far enough away that their music wouldn't reach us this clearly. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the window to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was unmistakably coming from our backyard, or rather the woods just beyond it. The song was old and eerie, later identified as "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf" by Henry Hall. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I went downstairs to find the backyard light switch. When I finally illuminated the yard, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as I stepped outside, the music grew louder. I ventured closer to the woods, heart pounding, but the song ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. We convinced ourselves it was a prank, perhaps local kids trying to spook the newcomers. The next night, however, our nerves were tested again. Just minutes after turning off the lights, the haunting strains of "Tiptoe Through the Tulips" filled the air, much louder this time. We were both visibly shaken. From the bedroom window, I noticed something glinting on the grass below. Despite Anna's protests, I went to investigate. As I approached the object, I realized it was an old, dusty radio, the source of the eerie music. I turned it off and held it up to show Anna, who was watching anxiously from the window. Suddenly, she screamed for me to run. Panic gripped me as she shouted that there were people standing behind me. I spun around to see 3 shadowy figures at the edge of the woods, spaced evenly apart, all staring in my direction. My heart nearly stopped. I bolted back to the house, slamming the door behind me. Anna was in hysterics, and I immediately called the police. 2 officers arrived swiftly. We explained everything, showing them the radio. They agreed to take it as evidence and scanned the edge of the woods with their flashlights, probably more as a deterrent than anything else. Their presence brought some temporary comfort, but once they left, the vulnerability crept back in. Thankfully, the mysterious figures didn't return that night. For the next few days, Anna and I lived in a state of heightened anxiety. We installed motion sensor lights and additional locks, trying to reclaim a sense of security. A week passed without incident, and we began to relax, thinking maybe it was over. Then, one night, we heard a different sound. Soft rhythmic tapping on the windows. We both froze, the familiar dread returning. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds, expecting to see nothing. But instead, I saw a figure in the shadows, tapping rhythmically with what looked like a stick. I dialed 911 again, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. This time, the police arrived with more officers and even brought a K9 unit. They scoured the woods and found signs that someone had been living there. Makeshift shelters, discarded food wrappers, and other debris. It was a temporary relief to know they were taking it seriously. Despite their efforts, the eerie occurrences continued sporadically. Strange sounds, fleeting shadows, and that unsettling feeling of being watched. Each time, the police found nothing concrete, just more evidence of someone's presence but never catching them. The breaking point came one night when Anna woke me, whispering frantically that she heard someone inside the house. We listened, and sure enough, faint footsteps echoed from downstairs. Armed with a baseball bat, I cautiously descended the stairs, every creak amplifying my fear. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I found myself staring at the back door, which was slightly ajar. I rushed to lock it, my mind racing with possibilities. How had they gotten in? What did they want? I called the police again, and this time they stayed for hours, patrolling the area, assuring us they'd find whoever was responsible. The next morning, we decided enough was enough. We couldn't live in fear any longer. We invested in a comprehensive security system, with cameras, alarms, and even hired a private security firm to patrol the area at night. It was expensive, but our peace of mind was worth it. Moving into a new home was supposed to be a milestone, a fresh start. I'm 26, and after living with roommates for nearly 8 years, I finally bought my own house. It was nestled in a small town in Vermont, about 2 hours from where I used to live. The town was quaint, the kind where everyone knows each other. But my house was a bit isolated, surrounded by dense woods. I hadn't met anyone in the area yet, not even the neighbors, and the seclusion was both a blessing and a curse. Moving day was hectic, and by the time I finished unloading the rental van, the sun was already setting. I had just placed the last few boxes in the living room when I noticed a man standing on my porch blocking the front door. He looked to be around 50, with a friendly yet unsettling smile. "Hey there, I'm your new neighbor," he said, extending his hand. Startled, I shook it and introduced myself. As we exchanged pleasantries, I couldn't help but wonder how he got there. I hadn't seen anyone approaching the house, and with the dense forest surrounding it, it was odd, to say the least. After a brief conversation, he turned and walked off into the woods. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of unease and curiosity. I quickly finished bringing in the remaining boxes and decided to return the rental van. Driving down the long dirt driveway, I kept an eye out for the man but saw no sign of him. The entire encounter left me feeling uneasy. Returning home in a local taxi, I began unpacking. It was late, and I was exhausted, but I wanted to get some furniture set up before calling it a night. As I was assembling my bed frame, a sudden knock on the door made me freeze. My heart pounded as I walked quietly to the front door and looked through the peephole. There he was again, the same man from earlier. But something was different. His body shook slightly, his head moved in an unnatural way, and his eyes were locked on the doorknob. "Hey, it's your neighbor. Can you open the door?" he called out, his voice strained. I didn't respond, just watched through the peephole as his expression changed, from friendly to frustrated, then to angry. He pounded on the door harder. Suddenly, he turned towards the forest, raised his hand, and made a strange waving motion before running into the darkness. Terrified, I called the police. They arrived quickly but found no trace of him. I described the man to them, but they didn't recognize him. They assured me they would keep an eye out and left. That night I barely slept, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. The following days were tense. I introduced myself to the other neighbors, hoping to gather more information, but no one knew who the man was. It was as if he had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A week later, I was walking through the woods behind my house, trying to clear my mind. I stumbled upon a small clearing, where I found remnants of a makeshift campsite. There were old tattered blankets, an extinguished fire pit, and empty cans of food scattered around. It looked like someone had been living there recently. My mind raced back to the man and his strange behavior. Was this his camp? I reported the campsite to the police, but they didn't find any substantial evidence to link it to the man or any criminal activity. Despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every night, I would double-check the locks and peer out the windows, half expecting to see that man standing at the edge of the woods. One particularly cold night, I was jolted awake by the sound of rustling outside. I crept to the window and peered out. Under the pale moonlight, I saw shadows moving among the trees. It wasn't just one person. There were several figures, lurking just beyond the tree line. My heart pounded as I realized the man from the porch wasn't alone that night. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, whispering urgently into the receiver. The figures seemed to be moving closer, their shapes becoming clearer. Just as the operator assured me that officers were on the way, the figures began to retreat, melting back into the darkness of the forest. The police arrived and searched the area thoroughly but found nothing. The officers told me it could have been local teens playing a prank, but I knew it was more sinister than that. The campsite, the strange man, the figures in the woods, it all pointed to something far more disturbing. Months have passed since those nights, and I've installed a comprehensive security system. Cameras now monitor every corner of my property, and I've even considered getting a guard dog. The man from the porch never returned, and the strange occurrences have stopped. But the memory of those nights lingers.